Hello, class. Moving on to document C now. Document C is a little bit different. It's going to be a chart. So the first things first, as always, I want you to put the motive or write the motive and highlight it at the very top of document C. And this would definitely be a cultural motive. And then underneath that, since this has to do with technology um, advancements that the Europeans had over the Africans, I want you to write a side note underneath where I wrote cultural motive at the top. So the side note should read Europeans were more technologically advanced, which made them think a certain way. So just because they had new stuff, they were more advanced when it came to medicine, when it came to machines, weapons, whatever you want to call it, that made them think a certain way. They are going to look at themselves once again as being the superior race, better than, and they're going to look at the Africans as being inferior or below them. And that is just a mindset. That's the way they think. And of course, that has everything to do with the cultural motive of why they would go into Africa and colonize and take parts of Africa that doesn't belong to them. So what I want you guys to do is, if you're looking at the note, which is right above the title that's in the middle, it says the Industrial Revolution led to many discoveries and inventions that helped Europeans take over Africa. Highlight that entire note, and then I want you to draw a little arrow up to the right, like I did. And this note, side note, or annotation is really important. What is in the chart will explain how the Europeans were able to take over and conquer parts of Africa so easily, because that's what happened. And I've discussed before with document A that Africa is not unified. The only countries that remained independent were Liberia and Ethiopia because they fought together against the Europeans. All these other countries that were taken over very easily were taken over because they were fighting against each other. It was almost like a civil war, like I mentioned before with document A. And it was really easy for the Europeans to come in and to conquer and to take over. But besides that, the Europeans, in simple terms, just had better stuff. It allowed them to conquer them very, very easily. So make sure you make that side note. Oops, excuse me. And from here, we're going to go ahead and take a look at this chart. So as always, you should take a look at the title of the chart, which is Technology and Imperialism. So you can either highlight that or circle that. And then I want you to make a little annotation or side note. This is the impact that technology had. Okay. So now looking at the chart, left-hand side, it's the technological development. So it was what was actually made and the year it was invented. So highlight technological development, and then I wrote a little side note or annotation that says what it is. And then to the right, please highlight use and the significance. So how they used it and why it was important. So go ahead and make those annotations. So what I want you guys to do is I want you to highlight all the inventions that are on the left-hand side. So highlight steam engine, highlight quinine, highlight electric telegraph, Bessemer process, Maxim gun, the repeating rifle. And then I want you to draw a little bracket to the left like I did. And I want you to write that annotation. Europeans had all of these, or they developed all of these, which made it very easy for them to go into Africa and for them to take over. So those are the actual inventions in the year that they were invented, and it allowed them to go into Africa and allowed them to take over very easily and allow them to conquer the Africans. So now let's take a look to the right of the chart. How each one of these inventions were used and why it was so important. So taking a look at the steam engine, and we should be very familiar with the steam engine since we talked about it quite a bit during the Industrial Revolution unit. But The steam engine allowed for a more constant and forceful source of power than sails on ships or horse-drawn carriages. All that means, guys, is that everything was better, faster, more efficient, and cheaper because of the Industrial Revolution. So before all the machines, everything was done by hand. There was no sense of transportation, and the only way to get from one place to the other is by a ship with sails, or walking, or an animal. Now you have steamboats, and the steamboats have these engines, these steam engines, and it allows for these ships to travel very, very quickly from one place to the other, um, along with the locomotives or the railroads and the trains. Once again, if you're not traveling by sea, you're now going to be traveling by railroads, so travel by land very quickly. And of course, everything that was going on in Europe, all these developments in Europe, the Europeans are going to bring all of that stuff with them to Africa when they do colonize. So they are going to bring their steamships. They are going to build railroad tracks and have locomotives, and they are going to be able to get from one place in Africa to the other, either by land or by water, very, very quickly. So this is important, especially when the Europeans go into Africa for natural resources, for raw materials in order to manufacture goods. They're going to set up factories where they can build stuff in Africa, and they need to be able to ship goods back and forth very quickly. So the steam engine was very, very important. The next invention was actually a medication, and it was called quinine. And I think I mentioned before, and you should have read this in your questions that you answered from the online text, but really early on during imperialism in Africa and colonization of Africa by the Europeans, they were only able to explore the coastal parts of Africa, meaning the land that was right next to the water, the ocean. So it was all the land that bordered the ocean, and they were not able to get into the interior or the inside of Africa. There were some people like humanitarians, missionaries, those are the people that were able to make it to the inside of Africa. But a lot of people who attempted to get to the inside or interior of Africa, they caught diseases. And the major disease that the Europeans would catch was malaria. Now, if you are introduced or your immune system is introduced to a new disease and your body has never seen this disease before, your immune system does not know how to fight it off. So what happens? The Europeans get really sick, they have no medication, and they die. So they're not able to get into the interior of Africa till 1820 with the invention and the development of the drug quinine. And that's what it was. It was a medication. And the Europeans figured out if they took quinine, they were able to fight off the disease of malaria, which allowed them to travel now to the inside or the interior of Africa. From there, of course, you're going to have the invention of the electric telegraph in 1837. And this was really important because it allowed the Europeans to communicate with each other instantly, over far, or excuse me, long distances. So I want you guys to think of how you communicate with each other. A majority of people now, they don't even pick up the phone anymore and talk to someone on the other line. It's just all through text message. So the telegraph is like the old school way of text messaging, and you're able to communicate instantly with someone that is very, very far away. So that is good, especially if Europeans are taking over parts of Africa, or they're setting up factories in Africa and they need to communicate with each other. This is the way that they do this. So the telegraph was very, very important. The Bessemer process, I think you guys actually should have read about this during the Industrial Revolution. I believe you might have seen this on one of the episodes of The Men Who Built America, but the Bessemer process was a way or as a method of manufacturing steel very quickly and very cheaply. And this was a positive impact um, of the European colonization, because when the Europeans came over to Africa, they began to help modernize Africa. And they brought with them all their ideas. They brought with them all their inventions. Everything I've been talking about, they brought with them. And they pushed that stuff onto the Africans. And a lot of the times, excuse me, it wasn't positive. It was a lot of negative impacts that the Europeans had on the Africans. But one of, I guess we can say, positives is that the Europeans helped modernize Africa with the building of railroads, with the building of tall buildings and structures, with railroads, with bridges, with all this stuff that they had in Europe, they are now bringing with them to, once again, Africa. So this is just, once again, one more thing that is modernizing Africa, is changing up the way Africa used to be. So with that, moving on, the last two are very similar, but the Maxim gun and the repeating rifle. And this is important because this was weapons that the Europeans had for a few reasons. But number one is how they were able to go into Africa and conquer so quickly. If you have the Europeans that have a bunch of these machine guns, and then you have the Africans who don't have guns because they are not as technologically advanced, and all they have is spears or bows and arrows, it's really easy to know who is going to win that battle. If there is a conflict, or there is a fight, or there is a war, it's going to be the Europeans, just because they have better weapons. So it allowed them to conquer the Africans a lot easier. And it also allowed them to make sure that the Africans obeyed and stayed under control, because they did have these weapons that were more advanced than obviously what the Africans had. That is going to go ahead and conclude Document C. Once again, please make sure you have the highlights, the annotations. If there's anything that you are confused about, rewind and replay, or please ask questions.